In nearly all ancient societies and empires, whether the Babylonians, ancient Egyptians, Assyrians, or Greeks, life was not very nice to say the least. Human life was very cheap, with massive amount of brutal wars and executions. There were massive amounts of slavery, with slaves having little to no rights or protections. Women were incredibly oppressed, and virtually all ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean societies were subjugated to totalitarian dictatorships, similar to what we see today in North Korea and Iran. Today, in the West and much of the rest of the world, we live in a much better situation. So, what caused this change? The beginning of the answer lies in the religion of a small people in the ancient Near East, the Jews. The ancient biblical prophets and later Jewish sages, which are called Chazal, influenced by mystical and transcendental experiences and the belief that humans were created in the image of God, came up with a moral code unlike anything else at the time. The first example of this revolution lies in the way the law was enforced. Unlike other ancient societies, in which justice systems punished and rewarded people based on their lineage or social status, Judaism enforced the law based on the individual's personal responsibility and actions. As the Bible says, "You shall have one law for the stranger and for the native born, for I am the Lord your God." Punishment was also based on the individual sins and misdeeds, as stated in the Bible. Parents shall not be put to death for children, nor shall children be put to death for parents. A person shall be put to death only for his own crime. Another revolution that ancient Judaism pushed for was in the status of women. In nearly all other ancient societies, women were incredibly oppressed by men and subjugated to rampant mistreatment, such as rape and prostitution. In Judaism, however, women were protected. There were prohibitions against rape, prostitution, and slavery. Marriage and sexual intercourse were only permitted with the full consent of the women. Jewish marriage contracts, ketubot, obligated the husband to provide for and support his wife. In Jewish theology, the oppression of women was seen as one of the curses of the exile from paradise, a consequence humanity is meant to fix, along with hard labor and pain in childbirth and other cruel stuff. Some of the greatest prophets and figures in the Bible are women, such as Miriam, Deborah, Hannah, and the four matriarchs of the Jewish people, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. This is why the prophet Jeremiah envisioned that in the time of redemption, where society reached its ideal form, the status of women will rise. As he said, "How long will you waver, O wayward daughter? For the Lord has created a new thing on earth, a woman shall encircle a man." Another revolution Judaism introduced had to do with economic equality. Unlike other ancient societies, which had rampant inequality and where the poor lived under terrible conditions, Judaism sanctified charity, tzedakah, which was meant to help the poor. This ideal manifests most profoundly in the Jubilee year, in which land was returned to its original owners every 50 years, preventing the monopolization of land by elites. This doesn't mean, however, that Judaism supports socialism or opposes private property. Quite the opposite, in fact. Another moral revolution Judaism brought was in the treatment of slavery. Unlike other ancient societies, where large segments of the population were subjugated to brutal slavery, Judaism virtually eliminated slavery as it was known elsewhere. In Judaism, slavery only occurs when a man willingly sells himself into servitude. Even then, the owner is required to allow the slave to rest on the Sabbath, refrain from physical harm and harsh labor, and share in service equally. This is why The Talmud says, "Whoever buys a Hebrew slave is like buying himself a master." Slaves were also required to be released in the 7th year and again in the Jubilee year every 50 years. Even when a slave did not want to be released, Jewish law stated that the owner should compel him to leave servitude. Judaism also introduced a moral revolution in politics. Unlike virtually all ancient societies, where kings were deified and ruled with absolute power, often tyrannically, the Bible and Deuteronomy heavily limit the power of the king. The king is forbidden from amassing many wives, symbolizing excessive political alliances, many horses, representing military and hard power, and large quantities of silver and gold, symbolizing economic control. The king is also required to be subject to divine justice and moral accountability, which is why he is required to engage in the daily study of the Torah. Many of the biblical prophets, such as Nathan, Elijah, and Isaiah, stood up against state tyranny, even when it meant risking their lives. Another cultural shift Judaism pushed for had to do with capital punishment. Unlike other ancient cultures where executions were rampant, rabbinical law made capital punishment nearly impossible to carry out. The Talmud famously says, "A Sanhedrin, which is a Jewish religious high court that executes one person in 70 years, is considered a murderous court." According to the biblical prophets, this revolutionary worldview was meant to change the entire world, not remain a local phenomenon. This is clearly reflected in the Torah's prophecies that other nations would be blessed through Abraham, and that the Israelites were to be a light unto the nations. This indeed happened through the spread of Christianity. Over the course of centuries, Christian civilization developed humanistic value systems based on the Jewish idea that humans are created in the image of God. These ideas laid the foundation of modern liberalism, especially in the West, in countries like the United States and Britain, ultimately helping to create a world that is a much better place to live in than the brutal ancient world from which Judaism came.